to Iceland about 5-6 times now, at various times of the year. So the pictures you're going to see are a sort of accumulation of those various trips, plus some taken in the UK. Iceland's a rather interesting place. It's really unique, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, because you'll find that it's the least populated country in Europe. It's about 4/5 the size of England, but the total population is about 343,000, which is slightly less than Leicester. It's probably got a slightly worse football team as well. However, only about 40% of the country has actually got vegetated soil. You can see from the green areas around the edges, but about 40% of that is bog. So there's relatively little agricultural land. And the big white areas in the middle are the larger sort of ice fields. And basically, if you see something that ends with the term jökull, it means a glacier. And if it ends foss, it's going to be a waterfall. Actually, Iceland is such a young country because even the oldest rocks are only about 16 million years old. And really, basically, it's a bit of the sea floor which has been pushed up above sea level. It's on the North Atlantic Ridge, about a 14,000 kilometer zone, where the American tectonic plate is on one side and the Eurasian tectonic plate is on the other. And they're moving apart at about a couple of centimeters a year. So as you can imagine, that creates quite a lot of earthquake activity. They get thousands of earthquakes a year, usually fairly small ones. And this is just an outline of some of the volcanoes of Iceland. Every name that you can see there is actually a volcano, and the ones with triangles are actually relatively active. But the one you may have seen on the news most recently is in fact not shown. It's Fagradalsfjall, which is there. I apologise to any Icelanders who may be watching for the pronunciation, but I'll do my best. And this is what you may have been seeing on the TV. It's about time we sort of went round Iceland, and what I aim to do is to go round clockwise, looking at some of the better key areas. So we're going to start round here, where everybody does, around Reykjavik. In fact, the international airport is at Keflavik down here, but there is an airport at Reykjavik which covers internal flights. And then we're going to move up to first of all, the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. And then we're going to cross Breiðafjörður. As you might expect, fjorda means field. Dropping off at Flatey, and then heading up to the bird cliffs up here at Latraberg. Then we're going to move across to the northern part. We'll be going up Eyjafjörður. And in fact, most of Iceland is actually just below the Arctic Circle. But if you were to stand on the north shore of Grímsey, little island up in the north there, you'd actually just be on the Arctic Circle. But in this area, we've also got the famous lake of Mývatn and the biggest waterfall at Dettifoss. Then we'll move on round through the mountains to the east coast, and then we're going to finish up at the outfall of the biggest glacier, Vatnajökull, where the ice carves as icebergs into the sea. So starting off here, we'll start off with Reykjavik, and it's a really nice city. If you stand on the harbour, you can start getting your bird watching in. You're going to get lesser black-backed gull, fairly familiar, and you can see that quite a lot of bird ringing goes on in Iceland. So quite a lot is known about the migrations and the movements of the birds. But here's the first of the more unusual birds, the glaucous gull, on the white-winged gulls. And we'll see a little bit more of that shortly. But you also get breeding Hoopa swans and Greylag geese, which are actually wild, not the feral Greylag geese that we might be more familiar with. And you can see the odd widgeon in the background there. We're going to start with a little bit of geology. This is Thingvellir, where the first parliament was called, the Alting, in about 930 AD. And it was called here because it's actually such a recognizable place for everybody. It's actually on that split between the tectonic plates. So one wall of this cliff is in Eurasia and the other half is in America. And at one point where the two are pretty close together, you can actually stand with 1 foot in America, 1 foot in Europe. And you get different kinds of lava formed depending on the viscosity that it's pushed out and the rate of cooling. This, as you might guess, is called ropey lava. It looks like ropes. And this is the famous geysir, a water spout which has given its name to all the other geysers all around the world. But unfortunately, geysir itself is a rather poor performer these days. But fortunately, only a few feet away is a more reliable one, a Strokker. And this goes through the sequence of water in the underground pipes getting boiled, and then steam builds up and pressure builds up, and then about every 10 minutes it blows off as a spout. So first of all, you get the first impression that something is coming up. Then it bursts up, and then it disappears back down the hole again, and repeats the same thing in about 10 minutes time. There are, of course, lots of waterfalls around, and this is Gullfoss, translates as the Golden Falls. Quite spectacular. Disappears into this great chasm, and looks, I think, even more spectacular in the winter. Everything's frozen, but the speed of the water and the force stops the river actually freezing itself. But back to the summer, and in the shallows, you'll find one of the first specialist ducks, the Harlequin Duck. Female on the left, male on the right. And this is really a North American duck. And the only place you find it in the Western Palearctic is in Iceland. And there's one other species like that, which we'll come on to a little bit later. They are really cracking little ducks. You can see where the name Harlequin comes from. So we're now heading west to the peninsula of Snæfellsnes. And this is the glacier, Snæfellsjökull. And Jules Verne actually started his journey to the center of the Earth from the crater there. What a strange place to start from, but there we go. And here you see some of this really rugged lava, where it's so fresh that it hasn't had a chance to erode or been sort of planed flat by glaciation. So this is pretty recent lava, and certainly within the last 5,000 to 10,000 years. And this rough area has got a strange name. It's called the Berserker Arm, because about the only people who could find their way through it were the berserkers, who were sort of Viking warriors who, maybe with the aid of a little psychoactive magic mushroom or two, got themselves up into a state and literally went berserk. You find some flowers in here. This is the Arctic poppy, not to be confused with the Iceland poppy, which is actually a garden plant imported from Asia, so nothing to do with Iceland at all. But the Arctic poppies are lovely little things. And here's another bird, the northern wheatear. Obviously a summer migrant. And the merlin might be after the wheatear. There are only actually 3 raptors in Iceland and 1 occasional owl, the short-eared owl. So this is the first of our raptors. This is the merlin. And here's a meadow pipit, probably his most likely prey. And here's the second of the raptors, the white-tailed eagle, bringing a fish in, but they feed on fish and also they'll take carrion. So if there was a porpoise or a whale carcass washed up, they'd certainly be after that. The reason there's so few raptors is there's hardly any small mammals, apart from a few introduced house mice and rats. There's the sort of wood mouse, but not much else. So there isn't really anything like lemmings that you might get in Scandinavia to feed raptors. So they're all either carrion eaters, fish eaters, or in the case of the merlin and the next one we'll see, they're actually bird eaters. But even in the winter, the area around here, as you can see, you know, it's pretty thermally active. So this little patch here has sort of thawed any snow which has fallen on it and turned it into steam. You can see the effect of the heat changing the colour of the rocks. And in winter you get these rafts of sea duck. These are nearly all eider. But back to the spring, and we're in the lovely little harbour of Grundarfjord. And here's another little group of birds milling about, but these in fact are not duck, they're fulmars. And the reason they're here is because this is the outwash from the fish processing factory. So they're feeding on some of the sort of contents of the fish which have been sort of chucked out. And here's a glaucous gull coming in to join them, taking anything it can catch. And here is a better view of a glaucous gull, in fact a pair. They're very much like herring gulls, but there's no black in the wings. You can see that here we've got a glaucous gull in the front, and slightly out of focus behind it is a herring gull. So you can see the black wingtips of the herring gull. If anything, the glaucous gull is a little bit bigger than the herring gull. There's lovely white wings, the white primaries, the pale trailing edge, and the all white tail. And this is the other white-winged gull that you find, the Iceland Gull. But it's not really terribly well named because it actually breeds more in Greenland and Arctic Canada. But it does winter in Iceland, and even during the summer you get the odd 1 or 2 around. And of course here's our herring gull again. The great black-backed gull. It's also, of course, the black-headed gulls, quite common. So now we're going to go north on the ferry across Breiðafjord up to the cliffs of Larsenbranger. And we've got these typical basalt columns. If you think of the Giant's Causeway in Antrim or Staffa, it's the same process. If lava cools slowly enough, the basalt sorts of crystallizes into these hexagonal columns. But I've never come across this effect before. I don't know what causes this, where you got the horizontal movement as well. Interesting. But of course these provide very good nesting areas for a whole range of seabirds. So here we've got our familiar kittiwakes. And this picture was taken in early May, and so they're still on eggs. But by later July, they've got well-grown chicks. See, there's sort of a nest which is sort of bits of seaweed glued together with fecal matter. Sometimes they have 2 chicks. And here we've got a group of guillemots, and we've got 2 species and a different colour form of the more common one. This is a common guillemot, the all black bill, but notice the striped flanks. And this one is also a common guillemot, but it's got this white movement around the eye and coming back here. It's called a bridled guillemot. Personally, I think spectacled would have been a better name, but anyway, it's just a colour form. But the further north you go, the more common they are. But this one is the other species. This is the Brunnich guillemot, with a white slash on the bill, but also you notice the flanks are clean, pure white. And so here we are again. Here's a common guillemot. There's a bridled. And here's a Brunnich. And here's a Brunnich with its chick. They build no nest whatsoever. They just lay their egg on a suitable cliff ledge. And there's razorbill here as well, another close relative. The shag. So by July, the shag has got a well-grown chick, and they do make some attempt at a nest. There's sort of a few sticks and bits of seaweed thrown together. And the black guillemot. Those lovely white wing flashes, and red feet. And of course, Atlantic puffins. Some are just sort of sitting around, and others will be going up to their nesting burrows. On these islands, there are no rabbits to help them, so they have to make their own holes. But they could do that quite easily with that heavy bill, and then shovel the soil backwards with their feet, as they've got really strong claws on their feet as well. So now going across the field, we meet the island of Flate, which just translates as flat island, which it certainly is, just sort of pokes up above sea level. I suspect a rise in sea level could eliminate that in a few years. And again, you're greeted by black guillemot. Sometimes you're greeted literally. And Arctic terns nesting here. And in the sort of rough pasture, you see there's a few sheep grazing, but in the rougher areas, you find snipe. And this one's just in the process of swallowing a worm. I think these are really cracking birds. Use that long bill to probe into the soft soil, looking for worms and any other invertebrates it can find. And you also get the whimbrel. It's relatively easy on Iceland to distinguish between whimbrels and curlews because there aren't any curlews. So we've got a flying one. And here's the first of our sort of there and back type maps. Basically, with these maps, what I've done is just superimpose migration data, mainly from the BTO, onto a standard map. But I've only been concentrating on the ones coming from Iceland, and preferably the ones from Iceland coming through the UK. So some go to Ireland, and some other come across from Fenner Scandinavia or Siberia, and then move on down to Southern Africa, to West Africa. Of course, these are mainly based on ring recoveries. So the fact that one was recovered around here doesn't really mean that it necessarily went straight across the Sahara. It may well have worked its way around. But back to Falaropes, and there's lots of shallow lagoons, some of which are fresh, some are brackish. And here we find nice numbers of red-necked phalarope. The name phalarope is actually from the Greek meaning coot-footed, because they've got little lobes on their toes, just as coot have, which gives additional propulsion when they're sort of swimming through the water. And they also have a sort of reverse sexual dimorphism. So it's actually the females which are brighter than the males. So in fact, this is a female, as is this. And if the water's shallow enough, they actually spin round in a little circle to create a vortex, which brings anything edible up from underneath. But this is the much duller male. And here you can see the female actually pursues the male, although it's back to the conventional position when it actually comes to copulation. However, after copulation, the female will lay her eggs in a little small ground-based nest, but it's the male that then takes over and does the incubation and looks after the chicks. And she may well mate with another male and lay another clutch elsewhere. Outer breeding plumage or juvenile ones look quite different. And finding their actual migration route has been a relatively new phenomenon. It used to be thought that the European phalaropes actually went down to the Arabian Sea. Well, the ones from Fenner Scandinavia do, but the ones from Iceland, and probably those from Greenland, and probably also those from Scotland, there's only a few there, but they'll take the same route, actually travelled down the east coast of America, across the Caribbean, across Central America, and end up off the sort of western coast of South America, joining ones coming down from the Yukon and Canada and Alaska. There's also what we would call grey phalaropes, and the Americans call them red phalaropes, mainly because we normally only see them out of breeding plumage, where it's grey. This again is actually quite dull, but it's actually the male. The female would be a much brighter red. Some breed here and others move on to Greenland. There's also greater scorp, cracking male. And here's a female with a whole flotilla of chicks. And in fact, I actually took this photograph in the pond just outside the town hall in Reykjavik. So they're quite easy to come across. And again, the greater scorp migration, most of the ones from Iceland seem to head for Ireland or the west coast of Scotland, whereas the ones that we occasionally get on the coast around the east, probably coming from Northern Europe. And these ones were actually photographed on Loch Indal and Isla in the Inner Hebrides. So these are in winter. So now finally we've crossed Breiðafjörður and we've reached the cliffs at Latrabag. About 14 kilometers of these cliffs with the huge numbers of seabirds there. We've seen most of them, already. But here we've actually got a Brilliance Guillemot defending its chick. Its chick is just sort of hiding behind the adult here against a raven that's coming in trying to grab the chick. And as you can see, there's an interested audience watching up here. But these Brilliance Guillemots are feisty little birds, and it manages to see off this raven. You can almost hear the spectating guillemots actually clapping. And we've got puffins again. So we're going to head on around the north to our next destination. As you go around where there's river valleys, especially where there's floodplains, that's where a lot of the agriculture can be. And you get what in Iceland is the Lowland Goose, the Greylag. And these migrate south during the winter. But in recent years, they don't seem to be going quite as far south as they used to. Again, that may be due to global warming. So here is one that was named Diana. So it was fitted with a GPS in Iceland. It left Iceland on the 21st of October in 2014, reached the Faroes, spent the night on the Faroes, moved on the next day to Shetland, stayed there overnight, had a few days in Orkney, and then finished up reaching Caithness on the 29th, and then sort of just hanging around northern Scotland. The upland or mountain goose is the pink-footed goose. In fact, the Icelandic name for this species translates as the mountain goose. So these are found on the sort of higher elevations. There's really only the two species of geese in Iceland. And this is the main migration route. They're joined by some from eastern Greenland, and they're mainly heading for East Anglia. And these some are photographed in Norfolk. In these sort of areas, you find another little bit of geology. This is a red-necked dike. Basically, it's where sort of basalt has been pushed up in a cleft through softer rock. The softer rock has then eroded away, just sort of leaving this arch of basalt, which is slowly eroding away from the sea. But as you can see, it's providing very good nesting ledges again. But there's also an unusual one up here. And that belongs to the raven. Again, it's easy to sort out the crows on Iceland because the raven is the only one. You get seals here, mainly the harbour seal, or they used to be called the common seal. But also some of the sea duck, like common eider. But it's worth looking at them quite closely because there are two forms of the eider. You can only really tell the males apart. This is the one we might be more familiar with if we've seen them off of northern England. If you go to the Farne Islands, for instance, the sort of grey-green bill and sort of smooth back. It's also got grey-green feet if you see them. But this is the northern race, which has got a much yellower bill and also has got modified scapulars, form little sails on the back. So if you compare them side by side, the Mellissima race has got the duller bill, but the Borealis race has got the much yellower features. And it's got yellower feet as well, if you could see them. So we're now going north up Eyjafjord, passing the odd white-beaked dolphin, with the humpback whale, which in itself shows how deep these fjords are. These are deep sea whales. But also where there's whale activity, it often attracts birds, like our familiar fulmar. And fulmar actually gets its name from the Norse for a foul gull. And it's a foul gull because its defensive strategy is to eject its gut contents, which is a nice oily mix, which would sort of foul the feathers of any predator. And in the middle of the fjord, there's the island of Risøy, with a nice little village on it, and its own taxi. There's only about 1.5 kilometers of road on Risøy, but if you're buying a new car and you want to keep up with the Magnussons, then it's got to have sat-nav and cruise control. A lot of the island is actually moorland, with nice little pools, some fresh, some brackish. You might find the common gull, common redshank, also the black-tailed godwit. And these are the Icelandic race ones, which are a bit darker than some of the others. And their migration route is quite interesting because it's evolving. The traditional route from Iceland would be either to Ireland or to the south of England. But some have now been found to be actually going to Portugal. It's a bit too far to go in one go, so they have a refueling stop in the Netherlands and then move on to Portugal. Now that's actually twice as far to fly. But in fact, staying in Portugal is actually quite a good option because it's much warmer, so they don't waste energy trying to keep warm. So they're actually in better condition come the spring, and they actually get back to the breeding grounds faster than the ones from the UK. So it'd be interesting to see how the populations of those two options vary in the near future. So this is how we see them in the UK. And this is a picture I took in April of 2019. So these were birds sort of heading on up to the breeding grounds, so mainly in breeding plumage. A few that haven't yet molted. But it's this one which is interesting because it's got colour rings on. So when I submitted those to the BTO to find out a bit more information about it, it was actually ringed in 2012, Harty, which is just the other side of the swale from this, only a couple of miles away. And it's been seen every winter, autumn, winter since, either around the swale or the Thames. But it's also been seen at Borgarnes in Iceland in 2014. So it shows that they are regular migrants between the two places. And this is just a picture I took at Frampton in the Hyde, just to show two individual godwits, which have been fitted with trackers. So the red one tends to head down into France for the winter, but sometimes it deviates. Sometimes it goes to Ireland, sometimes to East Anglia, hence being ringed at Frampton. And the blue one, again, sometimes goes to Ireland, sometimes goes to East Anglia or commutes between the two. So they don't always follow the same routes. Okay, sort of still back up on Risøy, we've got snow bunting. It's a male feeding a chick. And the rock ptarmigan, we tend to think of ptarmigan as being mountain birds. But of course here they're actually at sea level, but they're much further north. So this one's almost in summer plumage. This one's still mainly in winter plumage, which is of course white. So they actually molt at least twice a year. Once at the end of winter to go from white to more camouflaged bluey brown, and again in the autumn to go back again. But it's the females that molt first and quickest because they need the camouflage more, because they've got to sit on the eggs and look after the chicks. Here's a nice little covey of chicks. You find these wooden structures which are actually fish drying racks. They make good perches for the birds, and here we've got our snipe again. This one's a nice drumming flight using these special tail feathers which vibrate as they go into a dive, give that typical drumming sound. There's a golden plover. Now, it almost looks like a male golden plover if it was seen in the UK, but in fact this is of the northern race, and it's the female, and this is the male of the northern race. So if we compare that one with a male from the southern race, which I took in Shetland, you can see the northern one's much darker and richer colour. And again, most of the Icelandic ones actually winter in Ireland, but quite a few come through the UK, and then some move on through Iberia. And they're also joined by some coming from Fenner Scandinavia. This is a flock taken again in the Lochindal and Isla. That's the Bowmore distillery in the background. And these ones again are at Ore Marshes on the Sheppey. Here's a purple sandpiper. Nice flocks of those. Got the odd turnstone in there as well. And we're moving across to towards Mývatn. Here's Godafoss. This is the Falls of the Gods, because the way the Althing, the Parliament, worked was that each year a speaker was elected, and after the discussion he would decide what the result was going to be of the discussions. And in 1000 AD they were discussing whether to stay with their pagan gods or go over to this newfangled Christianity. And the Lord Speaker decided for Christianity. So on his way home he threw all his pagan idols into the waterfall, which is why it's called the Fall of the Gods. There's also a nice geothermal area around here. Lovely smell of sulphur. And now we've reached the famous Lake Mývatn, which translates as Midge Lake, because really it's the breeding ground for millions of chironomid flies, black flies and midges. And that's what attracts the birds, because they either feed on those, or their larvae in the water, or on the fish, which in turn are feeding on the fly larvae. So here we've got a Slavonian Grebe, also known as a horn grebe these days. It's taking a small fish. This is how we would see it during the winter in the UK. This was taken at Dungeness. Here's our phalarope again, red-necked. Amongst the ducks, red-breasted merganser. The more common ones like teal, ubiquitous mallard, tufted duck. But here's the other North American duck, another speciality, the Barrow's goldeneye. And again, if you want to see this in the Western Palearctic, you'll have to go to Iceland for it. That lovely, very distinctive white flash at the base of the bill, and the different pattern of white on the wings. And towards the end of the breeding season, they form these quite large flocks on the smaller off lakes, just basically chilling out. They'll winter at sea around the coasts. Here's a long-tailed duck, the male. No, personally, I think, and this is the breeding plumage, but I prefer the non-breeding plumage. There we go. And here's the female. A great northern diver. You tend to find this diver on the larger bodies of water because they don't like flying too far to go fishing. They like a body of water that's big enough to nest beside, that will also hold enough fish to keep them happy. Hoopa swans nest here. This one's sitting on its nest. This one's got 3 cygnets. But again, most of them migrate towards the UK. In 2015, a survey was done, and only about 8% stayed in Iceland over winter. Nearly half went to Ireland, but of the rest went to about 36% came to England, and 2/3 of those to the Ouse Neen Washes, East Anglia. And they're also joined again by some from Northern Europe. So here they are at the Ouse Washes, arriving, often still staying in family groups. And we can see, some of these have got leg rings with identification that you can see with a telescope or a good pair of binoculars. But some have also been fitted with trackers. And of course, if you're on migration, it always helps to have sat-nav on board. And finally, here's our third bird of prey, the gerfalcon, by far the largest of the falcons, bigger even than the peregrine. And this one had actually just left its kill of a pink-footed goose. So you can see this one has also been ringed. So it took off and just sort of sat on a fence post. You can see its ring again there. So these are mainly taking birds. The only mammalian predator is the Arctic fox, which again feeds mainly on birds or their eggs, but also will take any carrion, any washed up carcasses. So we're now passing Dettifoss, which by volume is the largest waterfall in Europe. And if you go early in the spring, a lot of this is still ice. So this is ice holding strange little patterns of probably volcanic ash. And now we're going to swing across the deserted area of the northeast. There isn't much to hold any population here. It's mainly mountains. It's our pink-footed geese again. And so we've reached the first harbour on the eastern coast, Jupiverg. And here we find some red knot. Now these don't tend to breed here, but they're sort of on passage. Those were taken in July. We've got a red shank here. So these will actually be returning breeders. They'll be breeding in eastern Greenland. So the adults migrate south first, and then followed by the juveniles, which probably need a bit longer to feed up before they're ready for migration. So we can see why they're called red knot. So here's their main migration routes. Some come direct from Iceland, some through Iceland, from Greenland, some from Fennoscandinavia also come through, and then some move on further south through Iberia and some even as far as North Africa. Well, if we look at a slightly different scale, it's the same distribution there, but this is the Icelandica race. There's also another race, the Canutus race, coming across from Siberia. It follows the same route, but then carries on much further around the west coast of Africa, right down to South Africa. And here's how we tend to see them in the winter. Some of you will recognise the beach of razor shells at Titchwell. And at Snettisham, you get vast flocks of them coming in off the wash at high tide. Then coming into the lagoon at Snettisham. Again, in breeding plumage, we've got nice ruddy turnstone and the dunlin. So here's the ruddy turnstone in Iceland. And their migration, again, sort of sometimes through or from Greenland and through Iceland to Ireland and into northern UK. But the ones we get in the south are probably mainly coming from Fenner Scandinavia, and they'll come through and quite often carry on again around the west coast of Africa. And again, here's the way we see them out of breeding plumage. And the dunlin, again, that lovely black stomach. This one's on a nest. The migration here is even more complicated because there are at least 3 races. There's the Shintsei, which again comes from some in Greenland, mainly from Iceland, comes through the UK, joined by more from Norway, Sweden, comes around here, and then joined by the Arctica race, mainly coming from Greenland. But there's also the Alpina race, again coming from Siberia and Fenner Scandinavia, and heading mainly into southern Europe. But when we see them, they'd be very difficult to tell apart. Again, we're back at the All Marshes here. Here we've got the red-throated diver, one on the nest there. There is its partner. This one's got a nice well-grown chick. The red-throated divers will actually nest beside much smaller pools because they're quite happy to commute to go fishing, and some will even go and fish out at sea. So this one was actually coming in from the sea. And we've got eider duck here again, nesting on their nice little bed of eider down. Another pair of red-necked phalarope. There's a male doing its circling bit to create a vortex. You might wonder, how close could you actually get to these birds? Well, as you can see, pretty close. Probably most of them haven't actually seen a human before. If you're wondering what that big roller is doing in the background, that's to flatten what serves as a little airstrip here. There is a remnant little flock of reindeer. These are not native, they were introduced for agricultural purposes, but it really didn't pan out to be economic. They haven't been culled, so they're still hanging on here, the odd little flock or herd. And now we come around to the largest glacier, Vatnajökull. You can actually take trips up onto parts of the glacier and in big vehicles with huge wheels. It's all part of a national park. This is Vatnajökull National Park, and it's not all glacier. There's a little bit of woodland here as well. Basically, if you ever get lost in an Icelandic wood all you've got to do is stand up, because the trees are so short on the whole. There's a few areas where you get sort of reasonable length trees, but basically the island was deforested almost as soon as it was occupied, and very few have grown back since. But some woolly willow here, attracting a bumblebee, but also providing a nesting spot for some redwing. Again, we tend to think of redwings for the winter, but here you actually hear them singing and see them nesting. Here's our ptarmigan again, and this one's a bit late with his molt. Fortunately, there's not many predatory birds like eagles that would be able to take it. So it's relatively safe from foxes, which Arctic fox would like to get it if it could. There's no golden eagles to harass it. And a lot of the end of the glacier carves these icebergs into a lagoon, the Jökulsárlón Ice Lagoon. Basically, they drift out to sea through a very narrow inlet. But then when the tide turns and the sea flows back in the other way, then the icebergs come back in again. So they shuttle backwards and forwards until they finally get out to sea or just melt. Some of them are pretty big. You get an idea of the scale from this boat passing through. There are birds here, of course. Here's a pair of eiders flying past one of the icebergs. Here's our eider again. It's the northern race, the yellow on the bill and these nice little sails at the back. Some sort of carcass floating past, mobbed by glaucous gulls, but with the odd herring gull coming in as well to try and grab a bit. This is an immature glaucous gull. Our Harlequin duck again. Here's the female. Here's the male. Our snow buntings again, the female and the male. These are cracking little birds. They're the species of land bird which nests furthest north. And there's a big colony here of Arctic terns. And this one's coming in with a fish. It's doing a bit of courting. There's its prospective mate. So it's probably the male coming in with a little fish. See if the female accepts it, which she does. This one's coming in with another fish. And then hopefully that will lead to breeding. And all these birds sitting here are all on nests. Well spaced out. They do have the most spectacular migration route, because the Arctic tern sees more daylight than any other bird or any other animal, because it spends the summer in the northern hemisphere and spends the winter and down near the South Pole. So it sees an awful lot of daylight. The migration route is quite interesting because they tend to sort of come down this way. And again, we're mainly looking at ones coming from Greenland and Iceland. But then they split. And some will come around the west coast of Africa, heading down towards Antarctica. But some actually split here and head for the east coast of South America. But they all end up in the same sort of area as their wintering ground. But the return route seems to be fairly standard for whichever way they've come down. They do this figure of 8, coming up round here, then going over there, stop off at this fuel stop. And the reason they take this route is to make the most of the prevailing winds as they go further north. So it's quite a complex migration. But they're mirrored most of the way by Arctic skuas, which are kleptoparasites. Given the chance, they'll mug one of the Arctic terns and get it to drop a catch. This is a dark phase Arctic skua, but they also come as a paler phase. And this is an outwash. Now you can imagine what happens when a volcano goes off. It sort of throws all that ash up into the sky. But what happens when the volcano goes off underneath a glacier, as not infrequently happens? Well, of course, then the weight of the ice traps it, and a lot of that ash really sort of turns into mud with the molten ice. And then eventually it probably erodes through the final ice wall, and then a great outpouring of water and mud spreads out towards the sea. And that's what's happened here. This has happened some time ago because it's got sort of moss and a little bit of grass growing on top of it. But this is a more recent outflow. And if you remember a few years ago, I think it was about in 2010, there was a big problem when Eyjafjallajökull erupted underneath a glacier, and that finally sort of threw some very fine dust and ash up into the sky so high that it actually went up into the jet stream and grounded a lot of aircraft throughout Europe for several weeks. So this area, again, it's got some cliffs. And this was actually an island originally, but has now been joined to the mainland by that outwash. Again, the usual sea cliffs, nesting seabirds. There's our Guillemots again. Our Puffins. But there's also a large colony up here of the great skua. Now, if we were in Scotland, you'd call it a bonksy. But the name bonksy, again, mainly comes from the Norse banksa, which means dumpy bird. And they really are rather dumpy birds. Also very raucous. If you walk through a colony of these, you really want a hard hat. So, there's a stray egg. But this is the main nesting area for them. And a final waterfall, Slavonian, again down in the south here. See the scale from the little folks standing there. And this is where you find the Icelandic wren, one of these northern races of the wren. And again, you find white wagtails. They're obviously a bit hard pressed to find enough to eat during the winter. So they're not that widely spread. They're around these areas where they can find insect larvae and maybe some spiders to keep them going during the winter. It seems to be traditional to end these talks on a sunset, but here you can take your choice, because this is sort of midsummer midnight. So it's either a sunset or a sunrise. But perhaps you'd rather I finished on something slightly more interesting, like the Aurora Borealis, which happens when the solar wind, the charged particles from the sun, meet the Earth's magnetic field and excites the oxygen and nitrogen atoms. And when they return to their ground state, they emit the extra energy as light. So nitrogen emits a sort of bluey purple light, and oxygen either red or green, depending on the altitude. It happens almost throughout the year, but can really only see it when it's dark and when it's cloudless, needless to say. So I hope you've enjoyed that rather whirlwind tour around Iceland, and maybe it will stimulate you to visit sometime as soon as we're able. Thank you.